but what are you going to do? Anyway, all right. Do you think we have a quorum? Should we start talking about barrels? So I feel like people are pretty much here. Hello, everybody. So our plan for this week is all about barrels, to talk about, we're going to try to recreate the barrel tasting. Not really, but just talk a lot about barrels. I don't have sound. Oh, are we muted too? You can't hear.
No, we're good.
We're good? Okay, it's you, Greg. Sorry.
You are good.
There you go. I don't know. We'll talk slowly so you can just read our lips. All right. So we're going to just talk about what barrels do, why we use them, a little bit about history of barrels. Oh, I forgot to get the barrel. I'll go get them. And then answer your questions. So just like our usual deal. Oh, and we are drinking today. You talk about what we're drinking because I was going to get the barrel stain. I'll be right back. Sorry, I forgot one prop.
We are drinking today a Feldspar 2. We've been talking a lot about the different wines we make, and the last couple of weeks we've got a bunch of questions about how are the Feldspars and slates in particular aging. So we said, let's open an old one. So here we got Feldspar 2. Only a couple hundred cases we made of it, and this is one of the few wines we've made which is majority Petit Verdot. So I'm kind of interested to see how it ages, and I'm going to taste it and find out.
Okay, I'm back.
It smells great, but Petit Verdot often does that. Oh, look at that!
I forgot. I was going to talk about that. All right. How's the wine?
Excellent.
What do you know? We like it.
What do you know? We like it. Yeah. Wow. A lot of it. Okay. Classic. Lots of dark fruit. Wonderful aroma. A little bit. Petit Verdot is wonderful with aromas. Wonderful with fruit. A little less smooth, I guess I would say, than Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot can be. So this one is a little, Sarah's going to love it because it's a little more al dente, as the, like the pasta. And, yeah, really nice wine.
That is not Chutan, I thought.
No, it's not Chutan, but it is the one that Sarah loves. It's smoothing out. Yeah, it's nice. And
so this was bottled 4 or 5 years ago now, right? It's getting a little age on it, so that's great.
But and nowhere, the color's beautiful. Yeah. Sorry, I'm looking at. Here's what I'm doing. We have a white piece of paper, and when you put a wine up to a white piece of paper, you can really look. Then you get to see the real color right around the rim of the wine. So you hold the wine like this. Don't pour it onto your computer. And I can see when a wine gets older and older, it starts to turn a little brick colored. Some people say orange.
Especially right on the very edge, you start to see it.
Right on the very rim, around that circle. And so this is none of that. It means it's got a long way to age. When it does go a little brick, that's not a bad thing. That's normal aging. But when a wine hasn't done that yet, it has a lot more time left. So
that is a good clue. I know we're often talking about how to know when you should drink wines or how much longer they're going to have or how they will develop. And if you don't see any browning or any kind of oranging in the color, and it can be pretty distinctive, then you have years left that it'll still be in good shape. It'll probably still be improving for all that time. And again, that browning it's not a problem, and a lot of people like their wines once that starts because they move into that like super soft and super smooth realm. So
great length on this one. I'm tasting it again and again. It's really nice.
So I am gonna barrel in on sorry. I didn't even mean it. On barrels. Oh my God. Anyway, talk about barrels. And so a little bit, because I always like my history lessons. How wineries started using barrels, why we use them, and what they do for us. And then we'll just chime in if you have questions or specific questions. We'll try to get to those as well. So, the purposes of barrels came into being basically because people made wine and they needed somewhere to put it or even to make it. And so there were wooden barrels of all kinds used for everything. Most things were stored in wooden barrels and shipped in barrels. And so the size and shape of a barrel is driven mostly by, it was the kind of biggest size unit that like a couple of big guys could like wrestle onto a ship. And that's why they're about as big as they are. You'll see, Zoe, if you can pull up the picture, there's the two different size barrels. There's like two that are slightly different heights. So there are kind of two like standard size and shape barrels. There's, of course, because it's France, the Burgundians have one idea of what a barrel should look like, and the Bordelais have a slightly different one. And if you can't find it, it's not a big deal. But did I send it to you? Maybe I didn't send it to you. Anyway, the Burgundy barrels are slightly shorter and fatter, and the Bordelais barrels are slightly longer and thinner. But they both have that same kind of basic shape. And that was just driven by, again, so it could be used for transport and storage. And what people found was they put the wine in the barrel after it was fermented, they let it sit, and then over time the wines were getting better and better, and it was the best way to store them. So that's kind of why like so many things, the use of barrels started out as just very practical. Just you needed something to do with them, and then over time, people started to see the benefits of them. And as people started to see the benefits of them, then they became much more of a kind of an important part of winemaking. So the oak forest that most of the European barrels are made from, or the Great French Oak Forests, were originally, I should roll back a little bit about what barrels are made out of. Sorry. Most people know that they're oak. Almost all wine barrels are made out of oak. There are some, occasionally acacia wood is used, particularly for those giant like tank size ones that are called foudre. You see that sometimes, but oak, for whatever reason, the flavor profile of oak tends to work the best with wine. And so that is what most barrels are made from. There are a couple different species of oak that are used. So the general kind of world of barrels people talk about, we're going to get old world and new world again, just like we do with the wines. But there's American oak, and then there's European oak. I'll say French oak because that's a lot of the way I think, but not all of it's French. And you can talk about Eastern Europe and all that a little bit about, because you're on the whole barrel scene. But the American oak barrels we almost never use. We have tried a few times, and there are actually two different species of tree. There are a couple different species of tree. So the primary tree used in American oak is called Quercus alba, and it's a very fast-growing tree. To me, it's very classic, sort of stereotypical textbook differences. The American trees, they grow faster, they're bigger, they're stronger, they're ready sooner, and they have a huge impact on the wine. The French trees, they grow more slowly, the grains are tighter, and they have a much more kind of elegant impact on the wine. And it's just kind of funny that, I don't know, it's like a stereotype of the world, but there it is. It's kind of true. It's particularly true in barrels. So we have experimented with American oak just because we would love to use it. It's local. It grows a lot faster, so it's much less expensive than European oak. It's right here. You'd save on shipping, and it would just be kind of a great thing. But what we find is the impact is too much for our wines. When we have tried to use American oak barrels, we have found that you get this huge kind of like wood and then wine, and you lose the integration and kind of the subtlety that you're going to get from a barrel.
And when we've tried the Eastern European, Hungarian was the question, but from different places as well, we get something in the middle. We get not quite as overt an impact on the wine as the American ones we've used, but not quite as subtle as the mostly French oak. We'll get into that in a little bit that we use now.
Yeah. So the big oak forests in France are among the best preserved. They're kind of the first national parks, or the first kind of preserved forests. And those were actually, the preservation and the management of those go back to Louis XIV, so hundreds of years ago. And what they needed was very big, tall, straight trees for their navy. They were trying to build a navy, and they knew that one of the kind of sort of relative advantages that France had over some of its rivals, Spain and England in particular, were these great oak forests. So they felt like they were going to have this kind of competitive advantage in the military, in the Navy, by protecting these oak forests. Little did they know that eventually that wasn't going to be so important, but lucky for us, they did an amazing job for protecting and learning about growing oak trees, learning how to grow very straight, tall trees, and to kind of manage them. And the reason that that's relevant to us is partly just so that we have these oak forests and they're very well maintained. And the second is that the oak trees, the wood that you can use to make a barrel is only below the first branches. So you have to have a tree that has started. The longer and straighter the tree grows before you cut it, or before it starts to branch out, the more barrel wood you're going to have. And that's because where a branch comes off, you get a knot, and where you have a knot, you're not going to have structural integrity for the barrel anymore. So you're going to start having leaks. And barrels are made all just from, here's my prop that I had to go get. So these are wooden staves. This is one of Dennis's candle holders. Actually, I made this one, but this is just a barrel stave. They don't usually have the holes, but that's why I don't have a barrel taken apart. But it's just these pieces of wood, and they're just cut, and they're hand cut to make the shape. And a normal barrel has, what is it, like 30 to right around 30 staves put together, and they're just squeezed together. I think we're going to queue up. Let's see. Do you want to put on my video, Zoe? So I have a video of how a barrel is made. I think that's kind of cool. I don't know. So we're going to talk about other stuff and just play the video in the background, and I'll explain what's going on. So to me, it's just kind of interesting. There's these trees, these very special trees, and then you can see, and this is going to play. I don't think it's going to make noise, but these are the barrel staves. I'm pointing to the screen. It's not going to help you anyway. Those are the barrel staves coming down. The trees are cut, and then staves are split, and then they're usually dried for 2 to 4 years, and they're dried outside. I don't know if this goes through because it's playing kind of slowly, but if you'll see where they're stacked, but and then they're hand put together. So you can see this guy. That silver loop is just the barrel hoop that's on the outside, and they just piece together by hand all the different parts, the different staves, and they kind of measure out what they think is going to work. While he's putting that together, I'm going to answer some of the other questions. So there was a question about sizes of barrels. A normal barrel is 2.25 hectoliters, which is about 60 gallons. And a puncheon is 500 liters, right? It's just over double.
Puncheon just means bigger than normal barrels. Yeah. Some are 500 liters, some are 600. Yeah, 500 is the most common. Yeah. The ones we've used are 500. Right.
They're just over twice as big as a regular barrel.
And a puncheon is different. It's much bigger. It's very difficult to move, to work with, but you get less oak per surface of wine. So you get a less of an impact from a punch from a big barrel than a small barrel. Just sort of similar how when we get small berries for the reds in the vineyard, we get more juice to skin ratio. Same thing, you get more wine to wood ratio when you have a small barrel. So.
Yeah. So and with that ratio is important because it's just going to affect how much the impact of the barrel is going to be on the wine. So the barrels, I talked a little bit about how they provide storage. You can see, I just think it's cool to see how they make them. So we're just going to watch them make them in the background. There's storage, but they also provide, we get a number of other things from barrels. So the biggest and most important is tannin development and just smoothing out of tannins. So because the oak is natural, it lets a tiny little bit of air in. You get this like micro oxygenation set up where the wood is porous, and so there's this little tiny bit of flow of air. In our winemaking, we have this sort of love-hate relationship with air and oxygen. There's times when we need a lot of it. There's times when we want none. And then there's a time when you want just the right balance. And it's very hard to create that right balance artificially. But a barrel allows that to happen. So, and what that little bit of air does is it's not enough to let the kind of vinegar bacteria come in and cause any spoilage in the wine. But it is enough to let the tannins develop and smooth out. So when we, this is one of the fun things we can do when we are there and tasting young versus old, but when we first put the wine in barrel, it tends to be very tannic and very kind of harsh, even too tannic for me. And one of the things that happens as the wine spends time in barrel is these little tannin molecules are very small when they start out. And because they're so small, your sense receptors in your mouth are very able to sense them. You really feel them. And as they spend time in barrel with a little bit of oxygen, it allows them to kind of cling together. I'm not going to get into the chemistry because I know I'm over my head. But anyway, these molecules form longer and longer and longer chains. And as the chains get bigger, we talk about the tannins softening or smoothing out or rounding out. And what happens is these molecules get so big that they start to slip over the sense receptors in your mouth, so you don't actually perceive them as much. And that is one of the biggest things that happen. And the only way to make it happen that we know of it is really to give them time. So there are some kind of artificial, the huge wineries will have a giant tank and they'll pump in a little tiny bit of oxygen, and they're kind of trying to rush that system along. But the kind of best, easiest way for that to happen and happen in a delicate way is to let the wine spend time in barrel. This guy's getting his barrel put together there in our background. So that's the biggest thing, is you get this little bit of oxygen impact, and that's going to just let the wines develop and soften. And the time in barrel is kind of the fast version of what's going to happen in bottles. So we keep the wine in barrel until we feel like it's at a point where those tannins have done most of what we want them to do. And it is one of the reasons why when we were talking about what would be good to taste, I said you might want to taste like a Rolling Hills versus, say, a Feldspar or a Slate or one of those wines. The Feldspars and Slates of the world have been wines that needed more time in barrel and more they started out as bigger and more tannic, and they needed more of that kind of softening time. So most of those wines you'll see have spent 30 months in barrel, or longer, a year or 2 years, rather than just one. Oh, now he's toasting. Look at him toasting his flip-flops. Melissa, you could become a Cooper. he's got like his flip-flops on in the cave. So this, to me, I think is really cool. So one of the things that they do is they cook the inside of the barrel, and we call it toasting. And what that is doing, and there was just a glimpse of it before, and he went fast. I don't know if they're going to come back to it. I remember this video, but the toasting actually softens. It pulls out a lot of the kind of harsher, greener flavors from the wood, and it softens the flavor profile of the oak. And it has a big impact on how the oak is going to interact with the wine. So one of the many things we do when we're trying to, here he's he's building the hole. That's the little bung hole where the wine can go in and out. One of the things that can, I just totally lost my thread. What was I talking about? Toasting. Thank you. God, sorry. What the toasting does is we'll go for wines. We'll go for barrels that are more or less toasted, and the level of toast will impact whether you pick up more kind of vanilla flavors or like bread or actual toast. I mean, some of the flavors that come in taste like toasted bread, and you're pulling some of that in from the toasting level. So we try to work with a mix of those. Sometimes we're gonna try to pair certain levels of toast with certain kinds of wines. For the most part, we don't want super heavily toasted barrels. We tend to go kind of medium-ish, medium plus, but that makes a big difference in what it's like. So we don't generally want a massive impact of oak on our wine, so we will try to use a mix of older barrels and new barrels. So most of our wines will have some combination of new and old barrels in them.
Great. No,
you got questions coming. All right, so questions, yeah?
Many questions. Let me actually talk a little bit about the actual barrels we choose and why we choose them. And there's a bunch of, Sarah's gave a great overview of barrel making and things. But barrel making is incredibly complex. We don't understand. We understand enough to buy them, but it's really difficult. Imagine they're literally going into forests and bidding on trees, actual trees, and trying to figure out from the outside, is that going to make a really good barrel or not? Does that have a tight grain or a medium grain or a loose grain? And how many, and all those different things from the outside of a tree. And then how you store them, how you age them, and everything makes a huge difference. So we've learned a few things over the years, and we've tried a lot of different barrels. And I'll tell you some of the reasons that we think the barrels we use are good, but in reality, we just use a lot of barrels and we like these best. That's what we're using. When we first started, we did a lot of medium plus barrels for the reds and medium for the whites. We've now gone to what's known as a medium long toast for most of our barrels, which is a slightly less toast, but instead of being toasted for 20 minutes, it's toasted very slowly for up to 2 hours. And you get a deeper toast in the barrel. I don't really understand what that means. I just know we tried a few and we like them, so we've gone to that. A typical barrel has 225 liters in it. It's about 290 bottles of wine, something like that, I think. But that has a 27 millimeter thick stave in it. We have gone to using, I believe this is a 27. Looks like a 27.
Oh yeah. That looks like I've seen it a little.
We have gone to using what's called thin stave barrels, which are 22 millimeters. And again, we tried them and we like them better. So that's the real reason we're using them. The explanation we've got from the barrel makers why we might like them better is that, I mean, there's some obvious things. It's the same size on the outside, but you get about a case, about 10, 12 bottles more of wine in there, which is great. So they get 10 liters, maybe it's a little more than 12 bottles of wine extra in them in the same space. When they're empty, they're much easier to move around too. They're not so heavy. It's kind of nice. But a couple of things, more air gets through them. That can be a good thing or a bad thing. It seems to be a good thing for our wines. We like that little bit extra of micro oxygenation, I guess. And then we understand, because the wood is thinner, the barrels are not as structurally not as strong. So as a result, to make a thin stave barrel, you have to use the heartwood of the tree. You can't use the outer wood from the tree. It won't be strong enough.
Right.
So you get thin stave barrels. They tend to be made out of a different part of the tree, which is really nice, because that we think that's the better and often even tighter grain part of the tree. So that's a change we've made over the years.
And barrels, I mean, so I'm just going through the question. Somebody said, have you changed your barrel regime, which we're talking about, but basically we're constantly, like with everything else, we're tasting, we're trying new things, we're seeing what we like. We right now probably work with 5 different coopers, I could think, that we've got currently, that we've got barrels and sometimes we'll have one that we love for a couple of years, and then a few years will go by and they won't seem as good, and so we'll order a few of them. One of the things we always do, I think, no matter what, even in the times when we've been like, oh, the Terrazzo are the best of all of them, we've never said, let's get all Terrazzo, because we know that the complexity is always good. There's always some, like, one will be great with the Petit Verdot and one will be better with the Cab Sauv, and then the next year it'll flip. So we just try to have a mix. So really every wine, if you go through carefully, if you're walking through the barrel cellar and you see, and you're very observant, you'll see the same wine is in a whole bunch of different barrels. Used barrels, new barrels, but then a mix of new barrels. So I see a couple questions about, can you reuse barrels? Yes, you can.
Luckily.
Yeah, luckily. We use most of our barrels about twice. Some wines we want more neutral barrels, so like Passeggiata, there's a big piece of Passeggiata, we're going to talk about Passeggiata next week, but big piece of Passeggiata that is fermented in barrel, but very neutral barrels that have been used for many, many, many years. For the kind of standard reds, like the Rolling Hills and Crumbling Rocks and Slates, those wines are going to be a mix of new and used barrels, but the used barrels usually will have only been filled once before, generally.
For whites in particular, we like more neutral barrels. We'll use a little bit of new, but we'll use barrels much longer. We have some barrels 6, 7 years old, because we don't want any. They're much more sensitive to any kind of wood influence, and we don't want that.
Yeah. There was a question about even neutral American oak. We try not to use somebody else's barrels if we can. We try to start with new barrels. Barrels are, because they're wood and because they're porous, a lot of the good characteristics of them are also what makes them very difficult to deal with. So All that wood is a great place to hide spoilage microbes and things that we don't want in our wine. So we try to start with new barrels that are perfectly clean. They've never had wine in them, and then let them age at our place so that we don't pick up any bad guys, basically. Because it's you can clean a barrel and we clean them between uses, but it's very, very hard to get that entire surface clean without and again, it's not like there's basically nothing in wine that could be harmful to a person, but it can hurt the wine. It could just make the wine go off in a way that we don't want. So, and then we find the only way to get used American wood on our own would be to use a lot of it, and we haven't loved it. So the ones that we have bought in the past, we have used over and over. I mean, we have used them once they were kind of neutralized, but we haven't been fans over time. That made that covered. But
there's a question about how much the barrels cost. I just got a email the other day from barrel users. I think it was the barrels we use from them was $1,100.
Euros.
Sorry, 1,100 something euros. So yeah, $1,300 or something a barrel. They're really expensive. So and when we use them, say twice, and our extra barrels we sell off to other winemakers or breweries or something like that. Usually sell it for 150, maybe $175. So yeah, it's an expensive thing. One of the questions we get a lot is what's the difference between barrels and things like chips, oak chips, oak dust, oak staves. There are all sorts of. Sarah talked about some big wineries or wineries, different wineries making, trying to get the oak influence without this huge cost of these barrels. And if you're making a wine that's anywhere under about $20, you just cannot afford barrels. They're so expensive, and you lose a lot of wine. We'll get to that.
And they're incredibly labor intensive.
And yeah, it's hard to do. So there's been a lot of experimentation with, can we just make big, huge staves and stick them in a tank, and then put micro bits of oxygen in, and we get something similar. There's oak chips you can put in wine. There's oak dust. There's a huge industry now of other oak stuff. And in our experience, we've experimented little bits with those. We've never used a lot of it, but we've tried a little bit here and there. And I thought Lucien made a great description of it once. He said when you do those other oak adjunct products, what you get is the flavors and impact of the oak floating on top of the wine. When you taste it, it's like frosting on the cake. When you use a barrel, it's integrated into the whole wine, and it just is. And when you taste like that, you say, okay, now I kind of get this, and now you can tell the difference as a taster, and it's significant.
And what we mean by floating on top or the frosting on the cake is that you have sort of the oak experience and then the wine experience, and they're back and forth. You might taste oak wine. It doesn't feel like one kind of cohesive flavor profile, and not just in a good way, because you can have a wine that changes its flavors throughout, but you don't want it to be like jarring, that transition. And so that's what it can be.
And I want to make sure, in case I implied that there's actually oak floating on top of the wine, that's not.
No, just the flavors. Just the flavors, yeah. So there was a question about, does the heating help to bind the staves together at all? And no, those staves are held together totally by the rings. As soon as you take the rings off, the barrel falls apart completely. There's no kind of glue or anything holding them together. It's all just pressure. And so it is one of the reasons that that the barrels are expensive, and that there's a lot of hand making, handcrafting. Everything's handcrafted nowadays, but they're actually pretty well handcrafted. And the shape is so important of the stave. So they're just cut in such a way that they're gonna piece together, and it's all pressure. So if we have a loose ring, the barrel's going to start to pop. So that's one of the things. There you go.
Let's see. We had a question. Somebody asked a question about have we ever used scraped and retoasted barrels?
That's a thing. The recouping thing. It's a whole idea.
In fact, there where they this is a process where they used to sort of shave the inside of the barrel off because the barrel, after you use it a lot, the wine leaves things excuse me in the barrel that gum up all those pathways of oxygen coming in. Right. And so when we talk about a neutral barrel, it actually kind of is neutral because oxygen is no longer getting through it. All those little whatever they are, microscopic passages through the wood are now full with things that the wine has left in them. So you can kind of scrape that off and retoast. We have not tried it. There's also a new one you can shoot. I don't know, CO2, frozen CO2 pellets or something in the barrel. There's all these people trying stuff. I guess we're skeptical for two reasons. I've heard that the wine does penetrate quite a bit into the wood. So if you don't scrape off everything that could possibly have wine in it, when you retoast, now you're toasting wine.
You get a cooked wine.
You get cooked wine.
Yeah.
And that's not good. And if you scrape really deep, now you've taken off all of that original toast. That's kind of hard to retoast something like that and still have a barrel that can.
That's structurally sound. So especially because we start with these thin staves, if you start scraping too much of it off, you're going to have something that's dangerous as far as holding the wine and not breaking.
Yep.
And so we said a barrel has about 25 cases of wine in it. So a barrel breaking would be a big deal. Even a little tiny leak we get upset about, but mostly if it's a leak, it's like a pinhole. But yeah, so there are a lot of questions about, do we have our barrels kind of custom made? We order exactly what we want in terms of the toast levels and what forest they're coming from, but the cooper is putting that together for us. So we are buying off a list of options. I don't know, maybe it's more like ordering a car than it is like ordering having a suit tailor made. I mean, you're not picking every single combination, but you can say, I want this and this and this, and these combinations are possible. We have not tried a barrel that's a mix of French and American oak. We have tried barrels that are a mix of different European kinds of oak. So for a long time in the American wine market, all that was available from Europe was French oak. And that was the big oak forests in Europe are in France and then in Eastern Europe. So kind of Hungary, Romania has some, kind of, I think Albania has some. Bulgaria. So it was really, and again, it's so much of life just ties into what's happened in history. But French oak became completely the norm in large part because the Iron Curtain, there was no trade east to west. So during the whole Cold War, the whole Eastern European barrel world kind of fell apart. I think there was some barrel making used for the kind of Eastern European communist countries, but there wasn't a really great, robust, high-end wine industry going there at that time, just because of what the economy was like and what the history was like. So because this is an industry that moves slowly and the staves have to be aged for years and the forests have to be managed well, those Eastern European forests have only become available to us in the last 5-10 years, like relatively recently, just because of the time it took from kind of the opening up of that East-West trade again, to let that trickle into the wine industry. So we do have now we're seeing some barrels that are a mix of those forests, because it does open up a little bit different, just kind of like with the vines where we like to have different growing conditions because it's going to affect the way the grapes taste. Being able to pull from different forests is going to have an effect on what the barrel is like, and therefore add some interest to the wine. So these new Mikel guys, they use, Francis Mikel uses some mix, right?
Yep, and that's in each barrel they use a little bit of German, Swiss, sometimes Austrian oak in each barrel, and we really like those barrels. They're wonderful. So it's not just France. It's good.
Yeah.
A little bit about we use some different barrels for different things. So we buy probably use 60 new barrels a year. We use a couple of new barrels on our Chardonnays, and not because we need to run that program through so that we have older neutral barrels. Eventually we have to retire them, so we need some new to come in and replace it. We try really hard to get low impact barrels there, and in fact our Chardonnay Reserve often is mostly new oak, but if we do that job well, which is great. We use a lot of new oak on all of the free run wines that we get. The press wines, we've talked about the difference in the past. I think the press wines, we've gone back and forth over years. We're using fewer. We've settled on using more once used barrels on our press wines because we often leave them in barrel for a long time, and that's good enough. We don't need to use a new barrel to do that. It works well. We used to use a lot of new barrels on Syrah. We've backed way off of that. We loved our early Syrahs, but they had a little too much barrel influence for us. So we decided we're going to pull back on that. And then Pinots, we never use new barrels on Pinot. We think it's a little bit more delicate. And that's sort of following convention too. You know, he said that you buy these new barrels for $1,200 or $1,500 each. In Burgundy, there are a lot of winemakers who will buy new barrels and give them to a friend in Bordeaux or somewhere to use for a year and give them back because they want once used barrels. They do not want new barrels. So you spend all this money and then you could, yeah, it's kind of crazy. But
Pinot is very delicate.
Pinot's very delicate.
Even those super fancy, super tight grain, whatever barrels, they can overwhelm a Pinot. So there's a question of barrel price landed, or does it? You have to add shipping. It depends. If you buy the entire container of barrels, which we usually do, that's why we usually get about 60 because you can fit 66, I think, barrels on a container. They'll usually throw in the shipping for you, but sometimes not. So it just depends. It depends on the year and what else is going on. So there's a great question, Valerie. This could be a whole conversation. What part of winemaking process has the biggest effect on mouthfeel? Everything. But barrels is a big piece of it. I mean,
buying land.
Buying land, yeah. It is little bits. I can't say one thing because it really is a combination of a whole bunch of different factors. So, I mean, Ed said buying land because it's what the grapes were like when you picked them in terms of ripeness, and in terms of what their skins were like and kind of what the grapes were like when you picked them. And then how you treat them during fermentation. So how many times you give them air, how quickly you pump them over, that's going to have a big impact on mouthfeel. How long you leave the grapes on their skins is going to have an impact. And then the kinds of barrels, and then how much time they spend in barrel. And then whether or not, when the wines are in barrel, you stir the lees. So we've talked about lees before, but lees are the little, like little kind of powdery, creamy stuff. There's like the little bits of seeds and skins that are in yeast, mostly dead yeast, that are left over after fermentation. We put those in, a little bit of that in each barrel with the wine, and then we stir that throughout months after the end of fermentation. All of that has a big impact on mouthfeel. Did I miss anything? I mean,
mouthfeel is, I sort of glibly said, mouthfeel is what we are really trying to get at Black Ankle. That's our thing. So everything we do is trying to get better mouthfeel, from buying the right soil, finding the right soils, to how we treat the vines in the vineyard, to how we treat the soil in the vineyard, to when we pick, to everything that Sarah mentioned just is really important. So that's a tough question to answer, I guess.
Yeah.
We had a couple of questions about how do we work with and treat the barrels in the winery, and Sarah mentioned about the lees in there. For white wines, our typical routine is once it goes in barrels, it gets stirred twice a week to stir up that lees. The lees will fall slowly to the bottom. Stir it up so it's all in the wine. So we'll stir twice a week. We'll top once a week through about the 6 or 8 month life of those wines. That's about the most we ever keep a white wine in barrel. So the red's a little different. We the first
2 months maybe,
up to 4 or 5 months sometimes. It depends on the wine and the year and what we're thinking, but we will stir that lees once a week, and we'll top the wines once a week in the beginning, then once every 2 weeks. And then when it gets to spring and we've decided they've had enough stirring, we put the bung in really tight and we leave the barrel for about 6 weeks.
The bung is a little rubber plug on top.
Yeah. And so we leave it in about 6 weeks. The wine will still evaporate, but you'll get if you put it in tight enough, what you'll have is a vacuum left behind. You won't have air in there. So after 6 weeks, we come through and top. We probably lose, it's called the angel's share. You lose something like anywhere from 2 to 6% of the barrel every year. And it depends a lot on the humidity in the room. The more humid it is, the less it evaporates. The alcohol will still evaporate, but the wine itself won't. So we have now humidified our barrel room up to about 80–85% humidity all year. So we lose a little bit less wine,
Right.
but you still lose quite a bit.
And
And you have to top a lot in the beginning because especially a new barrel will immediately absorb a whole bunch of wine, which you lose.
Right,
And there's nothing to do about that.
and it's one of the advantages of barrels is that you help concentrate the wine. So what you lose in the evaporation is you lose water basically. So what you get is a little more concentrated. So we can decide how much humidity we want to keep depending on how much concentration we want to add. But it is kind of a bummer to lose the wine.
Yeah.
So.
And there's a question about how we clean barrels. That's a really, it's a great question, and I'm not sure we know all the answers. We've gone at a couple of different methods.
Whether it's right or not.
We started with, we went to hot water originally, so 180 degrees with an impingement thing spinning around inside the barrel, throwing,
like a little nozzle that shoots really hard at the barrel. Yeah.
There's basically three methods: hot water, steam, and ozone. We don't like ozone because it's dangerous, and we're not really into killing everything in a barrel. Ozone is a disinfectant, so it kind of kills all the bad stuff you might have in a barrel, but it kills all the good stuff you might have in the barrel too. It's not really our style, I guess.
Yeah.
We've last year, 2 years ago, I think we bought a steam machine. Yeah. So now we, in part, trying to use less water instead of using 10, 12, 15 gallons of water to clean a barrel. Now we use one because steam gets really hot and it just kind of pulls everything out.
Steam can get hotter than water. Again,
strange, but it does.
Don't ask me the chemistry or the physics or whatever. So you can use less steam. It goes in the barrel. It basically, it's like a steam bath, right? It like sucks all the impurities out, and then we can wash that. So it's a little bit, but it's a lot less. It's a lot less dangerous than ozone, which is like, I don't know. It's like a little. Whatever. It's a little scary. Ozone is the most thorough. So I see a question like, but isn't ozone the best? Ozone will kill everything, but it will kill everything everywhere. It will kill good things and it will kill bad things. It's indiscriminate. So it's like a lot of things. It's kind of a matter of choice. For us, we are happy to have, like, we want to use natural yeast. We're happy to have some of the ambient microbes that are good available to us. And ozone will kill a lot of that. So for us, we're kind of happier to try this way. But there are places that swear by ozone. Again, it's kind of what you like. And the worker exposure is a significant worry that we have, and it's one of the reasons we don't use it, because in the right circumstances, if it's well ventilated, if you make sure workers don't work with it for too long, ozone can be fine, but it is toxic to humans, especially if it's used consistently over time. So it just makes us uncomfortable. So that's why we're steam. As long as you're careful and you have the right gloves, it's not going to hurt you. And if it does hurt you, right away. You're not like building, it's like you burn yourself. Yes, it's a risk that you could burn yourself because we deal with very hot water all the time. So that's the biggest risk we have, but it's not it's a very immediate and identifiable risk. It's not like some sketchy thing you could be building up and you don't recognize. So that just makes us feel better, I guess.
There was Lynn asked about the $20 wines. What they can't afford barrels, what can they do? And what they will do is get a big tank, and you can buy a little micro oxygenation machine. They're quite clever, invented about 15 or 20 years ago, which you can dial in, meter in tiny little bits of oxygen going in through a sparging stone into the wine. And so you get a little bit of oxygen, and then you can put staves down the sides of the tank, staves of oak, which are much cheaper than a barrel. And, or you can put oak chips in or square, those all sorts of different things, and try to mimic what a barrel does. It's never as good, but it's a heck of a lot cheaper. There's lots of theories of why it's not as good, but no one's really proven it. They just know for some reason the darn barrels are better.
Seems to work, right? A lot of it, there's a lot of very complicated chemistry that's going on that people just don't quite understand yet, in winemaking, which is great because it keeps it interesting. I think if it could be manufactured, it would be boring. It would be so. Yeah. So there's a lot, and there is a lot of work going on, especially in the mass producers, where they're trying to kind of like dial down and standardize as much as they can to make a product that's consistent year after year, that always tastes the same, that is measurable. And so to do that, they kind of simplify they're going to simplify a lot of these steps, and then they can make a product that's passable and cheap, but maybe not as, we don't think as interesting as if you let the world work its magic a little bit on its own. So there's a question about storing barrels dry or wet. We store the barrels dry. So we clean them with the hot water or steam, and then we let them sit upside down open, and they're drained. And once they're thoroughly dry, we will actually burn a little sulfur disc in there to make sure that nothing does grow that we don't want. And then and it's important that the barrel, again, we're going to get into the chemistry, but it's important that the barrels are totally dry when you do that, or I think it turns into sulfuric acid or something. Something connects.
Yeah,
there's water in there. It starts that thing. So
you could safely store them with water and some sulfur in them.
Yeah.
But the water is now extracting out of the barrels.
And 60 gallons of water for every barrel. It's a crazy amount of water. Yeah.
And you've got to refill the water as it evaporates. And most importantly, you're turning a once used barrel into a 2 or 3 times used barrel, because all that stuff you want in the wine is coming out in the water.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I see, Kathleen, your question about people who are storing, especially Petit Verdot, aging just in stainless steel. It's an option. The thing about stainless steel is the wine will not change while it's in there for the most part. It's a very controlled environment. Whereas the barrel, you're opening yourself up to a little more uncertainty, I would say. So we have experience with it. We have an idea of what's going to happen in barrel, but you're kind of letting the natural air flow happen and letting the barrels kind of do their thing. So I don't know. We've never thought about really aging.
That's an interesting question. I would have thought Petit Verdot would be one of the least likely things I would ever experiment with in stainless steel, because it really needs that metamorphosis
it's got very
to go through.
To start with.
I'll have to call Jim and see what he's cooking up in Linden. Is kind of interesting. But I would actually go the other way. I would think about experimenting with leaving Petit Verdot in barrel for 30 months instead of 18, because I think that would help get that wine a little softer and a little more little age on it quicker.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's interesting. I don't know what. It's funny because I know Jim, who's Jim Lott Linden. He's often very nervous about Petit Verdot when we've talked to him about it, because so Petit Verdot from the winemaker's side is it's very kind of juicy and big and dark, and it can be very appealing when it's super young. So when you're at the blending table, sometimes it's really appealing, and then sometimes as it starts to age, it can jump out of a blend. And so you'll have a blend that you put together with Cab Sauv and Merlot and Cabernet Franc and a little bit of Petit Verdot, and in the beginning it'll taste great, and then as those other wines soften, they tend to soften a little more quickly than the Petit Verdot. So sometimes that'll get a little bit out of balance, and then it'll come back around. But be interesting to talk to them and see what they're doing. I don't know. Yeah. That's funny. That's interesting. Yeah, I gotta check out Carpal's decanter. I'm not on the right screen. Anyway.
Someone asked a question about the barreling process for Terra Dulce. Originally, we tried putting Terra Dulce in barrels. And Terra Dulce, we have to add alcohol to get it. You can only ferment up to about 16% alcohol, and then the yeast all dies. If you want something to be 18 or 19, you need to add alcohol. We use neutral grape spirits to add into that, and to get it up to 18, 19%. And then something about wine that with that much alcohol in it, the barrels leaked. And they just leaked like crazy. Even indoors, they leaked. They leaked, and I remember Lucienne saying, "Oh yeah, it's because it's that." So yeah, it's harder. We're experimenting. Sarah's right. We're experimenting with some doing it. Mostly they're outside of the tanks. What we want is that Terra Dulce to go through all the temperature fluctuations of being outside. So really cold, really hot. All the things we wouldn't do to any other wine, we're doing purposely to that one. Right. So it kind of defeats the purpose to have it inside. But we're doing a little bit of experimenting with some of that and leaving it in barrel inside and see if we. Right. We could do a whole Terra Dulce talk too. But the Terra Dulce we have kind of 2 separate iterations of. We have the main block of it. That's
is outside now and is in the tank so that it can get the most abused in terms of temperature fluctuations. And then we have another younger batch that's gonna eventually get mixed in, but is in barrels. But the barrels do tend to leak, especially when they're outside. We had a lot more problems. The more we let the temperature swing, the more they tend to leak, and then it's just a mess. We used to have to water the barrels every day so they wouldn't leak, and that just got to be too crazy. So
Yeah.
There have been a couple questions about different rolling hills. So the 18 rolling hills, I know somebody out there is drinking I've lost track now, but the 2012 rolling hills. You want to talk about 2012 a little bit?
Wow. I got to remember the 2012. Well,
it was the 20 to the 11. Like 2012 was a nice year because 11 was like a little bit of a hectic, crazy time.
Yeah.
And then 2012 behaved much better.
Yeah, 12 was a really nice, just kind of normal year. I remember that. I love we had a bottle of the Crumbling Rock 2012 a few weeks ago. It was really nice, and I think we opened it on one of our Sunday nights. And I have not had the 12
Rolling Hills in a long time. Yeah.
But I would guess based on that 2012 Crumbling Rock, it's probably just a beautiful finesse-driven, not concentration-driven, finesse-driven wine, and I like those wines.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's good. I'm glad the 2011 Rolling Hills is behaving as well. I see you guys. Hi. You're right next to Kurt Paul's decanter. Pour it in that and see how it works. See what that does for you. I love seeing it, at least on my screen. I don't know if everybody's got the same configuration on theirs. The 2011 was interesting because it was a non-Crumbling Rock year because it was a little bit of a difficult growing season also. So sometimes those non-Crumbling Rock years, the Rolling Hills ends up excellent because anything that would have been siphoned off for Crumbling Rock ends up in the Rolling Hills. So sometimes it is kind of funny how that will work out. Some of those years end up good. So I'm realizing we're running. The clock is ticking.
Oh, clock is ticking.
It's almost 6. So
we have a staff question.
Okay, go ahead
about the barrel room. So if you've been in the barrel room, how many barrels can it hold, and why are all the barrels on the floor? So let's start with why all the barrels are on the floor is because it's such an incredible luxury to have enough space to put all the barrels on the floor.
So much easier to deal with.
It's so much easier. We when we first started, we had barrels stacked 3 or 4 high, and imagine having to go around and top those barrels. It's your client. It's like you got to have ropes, and I mean we didn't, but you got to climb all over the place. And you forget something, you got to climb back out and get it. You drop something, you got to come out and get it. You have to have topping wine with you, and if you spill it, it goes in all the barrels down below. Barrels on the floor is just an incredible luxury. It's great. We probably, as we expand, we will lose that ability. We're going to have to start going to racks and things, but we're enjoying it as we go. We can fit about 400 barrels on the floor. That doesn't mean if we go to 2 layers, we can do 800. 2 layers. You have to actually move them apart to stack above them so you can get to all the bung holes. So probably 650 or something in 2 layers and 900 and something in 3 layers. So still a really nice barrel room, and 3 layers is not bad. I've seen many barrel rooms stacked 7, 8, barrels high in California, and they have to then have all kinds of earthquake issues and things because we're lucky.
There. I see a clever question from Lynn. I guess it's Lynn and Bill there. Why is there a 2012 Rolling Hills and an 11, 12, 13 Rolling Hills?
Oh.
So that is a little bit that's very timely for this call because it's about what we wanted to keep in barrel longer. So the one that was labeled 11 was the wines from 11 that we felt like were ready to make a good wine when we did the bottling in 13. We had a lot of the 11s that we wanted to hang on to longer, so we saved a bunch of the 2011 barrels. And so the following year when we were doing the blend, we started putting together the 2012. And again, we had one lot that felt like we were happy with it as a standalone wine, and then we just liked to experiment, so we pulled some 13s in and we put some 11 in, and we put together these 3 years, and then we liked the results of that, so we just decided to make 2 different wines. And it's called 11, 12, 13 because you're not allowed to put the actual vintage dates on it. So those are not vintage dates. Those are the name of that wine. They happen to also be the vintage dates, but that is not the official thing, because that's just like the labeling restrictions only let you put 1 year on them. So anyway, so that's kind of why, but it just was, again, it's just the way the blending table came together and what we thought each of those years contributed.
And when we submitted that label for approval, 11, 12, 13, we thought there was a 5% chance they'd approve it, because they said you cannot put a vintage on this. And I said, yeah, you do it.
You can call it that, whatever you want. So that's our list. So now we know. So that's, I can't believe somebody's got an original slate. That's awesome. I'm glad you're enjoying it. You've got one more than I've got.
I have FOMO over that.
I know. So anything else that we've missed? I know there was a question about how big the forests are, and I don't know the answer, so I'd have to look that up. I will try to find out how big the French oak forests are. I know they're substantial. I've seen pictures of them, and I've seen them on the map, but I don't have like an acreage number. So I'm sorry that I'm not answering that.
They're big, but not big enough. It's going to be an issue. The next barrels are getting more expensive because there's a huge demand worldwide now for those barrels.
Those trees are usually allowed to grow about 200 years before they're cut. So it is a slow, it's a slow process.
And it's a forest, but it's really a farm. They're managing, they're planting every one of those trees, and then after 30 or 40 years, they're pulling out the ones that aren't growing straight and aren't doing, and making room for the other ones. And it's very,
they're planted very, very densely. Again, we talked about how they have to be super straight. You don't want any branches, so they're planted incredibly densely. And then, as they start to grow, they get the nicest, straightest ones, and then they cut the other ones and pull them out. And they're very, very managed. But so there's a question: is topping wine really just barrel consolidation? Yes, basically, we will break down a barrel and use that. We'll take a barrel and use that to top the other barrels. So that is great. That is a yes. Did I miss anything on our major questions? I always do the logistics. You have something else?
I'm going to do just a quick patio update.
Oh.
So if you come by Black Ankle, if you came to pick up last weekend, you saw we're at the phase. It always seems to be a forever phase of taking things apart and moving dirt and doing this.
Cleaning your closet. It gets worse before it gets better.
We're in the putting things back together stage, so it's going to get better and better. This is the fun part. So we got 20 of the 23 shade sail posts put in. That's huge. It's great for us. And then this week we're going to be doing a whole lot of working on the ground, bringing in gravel to put underneath the pavers for drainage and things. And then hopefully by the end of the week or early the following week, we'll start actually making the final patio surface. And that should be I'm really excited because this is the fun part.
Yes. So we're finally in the putting it back together stage. So that's good. So my quick logistics job. So number one, next week's happy hour, we were going to talk about Passeggiata. So we're just releasing the new Passeggiata. So I know we tasted it last week, and so it's out there. People are able to get it. But we thought we would talk about the history of it and how we decided to make it and how we blended. And then I think we'll try to taste a couple of the older ones and just kind of see what they're doing. It's not a wine that's really designed to age forever. It doesn't have a lot of those big tannic kind of aging qualities. It's a wine that's made to drink, but it'll be interesting to see. I think it will. Some of the older vintages are still pretty good. So we will try them and see what we think. So that's next week's happy hour. Next week is Memorial Day, but I don't know about you, but I'm going to be in town. So we're going to just do it on Sunday night, unless we get an outcry that it ought to be Monday because everyone's traveling, because there's some miracle we'll change. But I think we'll stick with Sunday night at 5 because that seems to be a time people remember. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to talk Passeggiata. This week, we were really hoping, since next weekend's Memorial Day, to come up with some kind of like barbecue food truck and celebration, but we could not pull it off. There's a huge meat shortage, and so a lot of the barbecue truck places were saying they couldn't guarantee us enough a supply if they tried to come out. So we're just sticking with our bundles, so just like we did this week. So we've put together some fun packages where we've paired a wine and we've pulled some of our favorite cheeses, and then crackers or baguettes, depending, and maybe olives or olive oil and those kind of fun things. So we have got that put together again for next week. Those bundles are on our website, and you can get them there. Do the usual pickup. Okay, potential opening. We don't know when we're going to be open. The governor's like kind of loosening up last week, very specifically said does not include us. There was much discussion in the industry about it, and we're quite clear that we're allowed to continue with curbside. We don't know what will happen this week. I think it's a reasonable guess that we will be able to open in some capacity in some couple of weeks, depending on kind of how it all goes. We will have lots of information about how that's going to work. For sure, when we start, it's going to be very limited. We're going to do reservations. We're going to make sure that we have spacing. We have done all kinds of cleaning protocols anyway, but all that's going to be just amped up one step more. But just keep an eye out for that. But it will be, even when we're allowed to open, it's going to be in a small, limited capacity, probably only outdoors. But it is partly why we're making this massive patio, and it keeps growing bigger and bigger and bigger as we realize we're going to want more and more space. So we're
lucky
excited to have that.
We're lucky to have a lot of outdoor space. So
yeah,
we will have to do this whole distancing thing, but hopefully we can accommodate many of you, even with reservations, even apart. We'll do our best.
Yeah. So we are always cooking up new ideas for happy hours. So feel free to send any questions or ideas if you have for us. One thought that we had was to put it back on all of you and do some kind of Black Ankle cooking pairing, wine, make your favorite recipe. So if people enjoy cooking enough that they would like to come up with some recipes, you don't have to invent the recipe, but even just like come up with your favorite Black Ankle pairing. We thought maybe we could organize a happy hour where people either posted them ahead of time and we went through them, or we just passed the Zoom around and different people kind of showed us their recipes and their pairing and described them. So people are like that idea, and you guys enough people would participate. We will try it. And then we thought maybe the prize could be that you would get a guaranteed reservation on the day we open. If you win the best pairing. I don't know. We're trying to come up with stuff that seems fun. So that's a thought. So those of you who are chefs out there, let us know if that's something you'd be into. And if not, then we'll just keep talking ourselves, whatever. We keep going. So I think we've covered our list.
Wait, one more thing.
Oh, no, we haven't.
One more thing.
There you go. See, there's
Simon
already one.
there.
Oh, here's Simon. He was fascinated. You see, super. Here he is. You gotta go down a little farther. You can see he finds this fascinating, just like always. There he is. Okay, yeah. Weren't we guys? So interesting. Anyway, that's who I've been scratching throughout. So, all right. Well, thanks. Oh, here you go. He likes to pair his. I like that. I like to pair my wine with a real glass. That's about my level of wine pairing too. But whatever.
It goes well.
I don't like to have to cook, but anyway, that's why I want you people to have to cook. No, we don't have to. All right. So, thank you, everybody. Have a great week, and we will be back next week to talk about. Oh wait, curbside pickup still every Saturday, 1 to 4. Did I miss anything else? They're always prompting me. All right, I think we're good.
Great.
Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.